Are you ready to dive into the dark depths of the ocean, where secrets are hidden that will make your heart race? Today, we're going to take a dive you won't soon forget. In this video, you can expect 3 stories that will send cold shivers down your spine. From disturbing encounters to events that will leave even the bravest of us reeling. Be warned, the final story has what it takes to give you sleepless nights. Cruel submarine discovery. The year is 2003 when a Chinese fishing boat somewhere in the Yellow Sea records a strange discovery. An ominous antenna-like something sticking out of the middle of the water. As the boat approached the peculiar object, the crew quickly realized that they had indeed just encountered the periscope of a submarine. Since the submarine was just drifting aimlessly on the water, the men decided to inform the Navy, which immediately sent 2 boats. At first, there was a suspicion that it might be a submarine from a neighboring nation. Such a case, in which the vessel would have entered foreign waters without permission, would certainly have made waves. But as the 2 naval vessels got closer, they were able to clearly identify it as a Chinese submarine. The summoned team didn't falter and immediately tried to contact the crew of the mysterious submarine, but the only response they received was a yawning radio silence. To finally find out what was behind this incident, the submarine was boarded the next day. But when the team opened the hatch, they were immediately confronted with a strange circumstance. Inside the submersible, it was pitch black. In the light of the flashlights, the eerie extent of the discovery became visible. The lifeless bodies of the crew were scattered on the floor of the submarine. The strange thing was the fact that the deceased were still at their posts, as if they had passed away completely unexpectedly and from one moment to the next. The sad result was that a total of 71 bodies were on board the submarine. There was no trace of any survivors. Several months after this incident, several officials and high-ranking naval officers had to take their hats. Officially, the dismissals were based on improper conduct and lack of controls. However, because the discovery was initially kept top secret, it took some time before the truth about the death submarine leaked out. Normally, the vessel was designed to carry a crew of about 55 people, but as mentioned, more than 70 bodies were discovered on board in the aftermath. It was speculated that the submarine might have undergone some kind of special test. In detail, it was a so-called diesel-electric submarine. This means that the diesel engine is used to fire all functions and propulsion while charging large batteries. On the surface, the diesel engine in turn sucks in air for ventilation. This works even when the submarine is partially submerged for camouflage. And now things begin to get even more inexplicable. When the fishing boat discovered the submarine, the engine was on for some reason, but without ventilation. In this way, the engine probably used up all the air inside the submarine within 2 minutes. A minute after the air was sucked out of the interior, the men on board would have been dizzy. Another 60 seconds later, they all would have been unconscious. Most likely, the whole thing happened so fast that the crew fainted before they knew what was happening to them. Another explanation is based on the assumption that the diesel engine fed the exhaust gases into the submarine, which would have been no less deadly. Divers in distress. In September 1975, 2 divers in the North Sea were tasked with descending 120 meters to unknot a rope that had become wrapped around the guide rod of a machine. This was a so-called blowout preventer, a device used in oil and gas drilling that is essential for the operation of the pipeline. When a professional diver dedicates himself to such a task, he does not simply dash downward only to resurface afterwards. To prevent the occurrence of decompression sickness, it is important to strictly monitor the required decompression time of the body. Due to this, divers go into special metal chambers called diving bells. When it is time to do their work, the divers can leave the chambers through hatches. Equipped with beds, washrooms, and food, it is possible for professional divers to spend up to a month at a time in such a diving bell. After their work is done, they only have to perform 1 long decompression instead of 1 after each dive. And after the men mentioned at the beginning untangled the rope, they were pulled up to about 95 meters, where they then entered a small underwater complex. In total, the structure had 3 separate chambers. At one end was the diving bell, at the other was the living area, and in between was a passageway for transfers between these 2 areas only. At about 9:50 p.m., the divers sealed the transfer chamber and began to equalize the pressure. But as the gas was pumped in, they discovered a small leak on the two sealed rings. After the men removed some dirt from the rings, the seal initially appeared to be working as it should. However, a short time later, they were shocked to discover that the chamber was actually leaking again. Instead of taking another closer look at the problem, the divers were instructed by their supervisor to retreat to the living area. This would already protect them from further pressure loss. No sooner said than done. Once they were inside the chamber, the supervisor pumped in a little helium gas to seal the door. Thus, on the surface, the supervisor has a series of gauges and valves to control and monitor conditions in the chamber. These are set up so that each chamber has its own gauge, though they can also be reconfigured to provide a reliable backup in the event of a malfunction. But as fate would have it, the supervisor made a momentous mistake. After he had fed the helium into the room, the door was actually closed correctly. However, he had forgotten to reconfigure the corresponding measuring device from the middle transfer chamber to the living room. As a result, it appeared to him that the chamber was still losing pressure. So, in his ignorance, he began pumping several tons of pure helium into the room. What he didn't realize was that instead of sealing the door, he was creating extreme pressure in the room. Before the supervisor became aware of his mishap, several minutes passed. In the end, the pressure in the living room was almost double what it should have been. The rapid compression, combined with the high heat transfer of the helium gas, caused the temperature inside to rise to an excruciating 49 degrees Celsius. And that at a humidity of almost 100%. And the two trapped divers? Well, they tried desperately to pry open the hatch door, an endeavor that was doomed to failure from the start because of the high pressure in the chamber. For some unknown reason, the supervisor was subsequently unable to release the pressure in the room. To somehow combat that, the divers ripped their mattresses from the fixtures and lay down on the cool aluminum. Eventually, another diver was sent down to the two trapped men to manually release the pressure and open the chamber. But by the time he arrived at the transfer chamber and looked through the porthole, the two men were already unresponsive. And unfortunately, not every story has a happy ending. In the short time it took to free the divers, they tragically died of heat stroke. In fact, this was the first known death among saturation divers due to overheating. Normally, divers tend to struggle with extreme cold on the seafloor and are more at risk for hypothermia. For this reason, the chambers are kept extra warm from the start anyway. Consequential attack. St. Croix is an island in the American Virgin Islands. Located in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, this is also an excellent island to go diving in the crystal clear waters and marvel at the rich coral reefs and marine life up close. However, there is one particular spot here that is particularly notorious: the Cane Bay Wall. Here, the seabed drops steeply to a depth of almost 4,000 meters, just a few hundred meters from the shore. In November 1996, 3 professional divers went to the gaping sea wall to collect some samples and make a series of measurements. Since the men already had several thousand dives under their belts, this mission seemed to be nothing more than pure routine. After 15 minutes at depth, it was time to return to the surface. But then something happened that no one had expected. Suddenly, 2 of the divers noticed that their colleague had disappeared in an impenetrable cloud of mud and dust. At first, the men thought his oxygen hose had ruptured, causing the air to splash around and stir up the mud of the rock face they were examining. But as they approached their distressed partner, it became apparent that a deep bite wound was gaping on his thigh. And just as they were trying to repair the injury, the attackers returned. 2 huge sharks that were about to attack the divers again. As the men desperately tried to fight off the sharks somehow, the situation was getting worse and worse. In all the panic, the divers had used up almost all the remaining breathable air. Again and again, the predators bit, dragging their victims into the depths. When one of the divers had to painfully realize that his 2 colleagues could no longer be saved, he mustered up his last ounces of life and continued to swim towards the surface. Before it went black around him, he felt as if he was sucking in breathable air through a narrow straw. Then he lost consciousness, but miraculously, the buoyancy was enough to propel his body to the surface. Then the pressure difference forced him to exhale, and he somehow managed to drag himself to the beach. With the last of his strength, he was able to signal to a passing couple that he needed urgent help, before he collapsed again as a result of decompression sickness. And although this incident could not have been more dramatic, the diver was also incredibly lucky. The two people he met were a doctor and a nurse who immediately initiated all emergency measures and summoned the rescue services. Thus, the man could be flown out and taken to the hospital practically at the last second. There, he recovered almost completely from the shark attack. Well, at least physically. The bodies of his two friends could never be found. So guys, and now we are curious about your opinion. What do you think about the tragic incidents we presented to you today? Feel free to share your thoughts and tell us below in the comments. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up and a subscription to stay up to date from now on. And with that, thanks for watching, take care, and see you next time.